I still remember the exact temperature of the conference room that morning. 68 degrees. I remember because I had spent so many years in that building that I knew every detail by heart. The way the air conditioning hummed at precisely 7:15 each morning. The way the morning light hit the mahogany table at 9 o'clock during summer months. The way Richard Ashworth's cologne announced his presence a full 30 seconds before he walked through any door. 8 years of my life existed within those walls. 8 years of early mornings and late nights. 8 years of sacrificing weekends, holidays, and relationships. 8 years of building something I genuinely believed in, for a man I genuinely trusted. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I am going to tell you how I went from being publicly humiliated by a man I had devoted almost a decade of my life to becoming the person who now owns everything he once had. This is not a story about luck. This is not a story about shortcuts. This is a story about patience, precision, and the kind of revenge that does not announce itself with fireworks, but instead arrives quietly, inevitably, like the tide swallowing a sandcastle. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, in the kind of neighborhood where ambition was considered dangerous. My father worked 2 jobs until his back gave out when I was 16. My mother cleaned houses in the wealthy suburbs, and sometimes she would come home and describe the homes she worked in with a mixture of wonder and something that might have been grief. I decided very early that I would find my way into those houses, not as someone who cleaned them, but as someone who owned them. I put myself through Rutgers on scholarships and part-time jobs that left me sleeping 4 hours a night for years. I graduated with a degree in finance and a hunger that I kept carefully hidden behind professional smiles and pressed suits. My first job was at a small investment firm in Manhattan, where I learned that the financial world operated on 2 currencies, money and relationships. I was good at both. By 26, I had been recruited by Ashworth Capital, a mid-sized investment firm that was gaining a reputation for aggressive growth strategies and impressive returns. Richard Ashworth had founded the company with his father's money, but had genuinely built something substantial. I respected him then. I admired his confidence, his vision, his ability to command a room. When he personally called to offer me a position as a junior account manager, I felt like I had finally arrived. The first 2 years were exactly what I had hoped for. I worked harder than anyone else in the building, and Richard seemed to notice. He would clap me on the shoulder during meetings, mention my name when speaking to clients, include me in dinners that were usually reserved for senior staff. I believed I was being groomed for something significant. I believed that my loyalty and dedication would be rewarded the way every business book and motivational speech promised it would be. I was wrong. The clients I brought in during those early years became the foundation of my value to the company. There was Margaret Hollister, a widow who controlled a family trust worth $47 million. She had been burned by previous advisors and trusted almost no one in the industry. It took me 6 months of patient conversation, of listening to her stories about her late husband, of remembering the names of her grandchildren, before she agreed to let Ashworth Capital manage her assets. There was the Chen family, immigrants from Taiwan, who had built a restaurant empire across the eastern seaboard and needed sophisticated estate planning. There was Thomas Blackwell, a retired surgeon with very specific ethical requirements about where his money could be invested. Each of these relationships was built on trust. Not trust in Ashworth Capital, trust in me. By year 4, I was managing over $200 million in client assets personally. The firm's total assets under management had grown to nearly $1 billion, and a significant portion of that growth was directly attributable to my work. I was promoted to senior account manager, given a modest raise, and told that I was an essential part of the Ashworth family. Richard used that word specifically, family. I believed him. Elena Vasquez joined the firm during my 5th year. She had been recruited from a competitor and brought with her an expertise in operations that immediately made the entire company more efficient. She was brilliant, methodical, and possessed the rare ability to see systems rather than just individual components. We became close almost immediately. Not romantically, though I think some people in the office assumed otherwise. Our connection was something different. We recognized something in each other, a hunger, a willingness to outwork everyone else in the room, a shared understanding that people like us had to be twice as good to receive half the credit. Elena noticed things that I had trained myself to ignore. She noticed that Richard's inner circle was exclusively composed of people who had attended the same universities, belonged to the same clubs, came from the same backgrounds. She noticed that promotions to the executive level seemed to follow patterns that had nothing to do with performance. She noticed that my contributions were frequently mentioned in internal meetings, but rarely acknowledged in the external communications that actually mattered. I told her she was being paranoid. I told her that Richard valued results above everything else. I told her that our time would come. I was still telling myself that story when I walked into the conference room on the morning that would change everything. The request for a meeting had come from Richard's assistant, Patricia. She had sent me a calendar invite simply labeled compensation discussion, and I had spent the entire weekend preparing. I had created a presentation documenting my contributions over the past 8 years. I had compiled data showing that I personally managed relationships that accounted for 31% of the firm's total assets. I had researched industry standards for compensation at my level and prepared a reasonable request. Not greedy, not aggressive, just fair. What I did not know was that Richard had also invited 3 other members of the senior leadership team to that meeting. Bradley Hamilton, the chief operating officer, who had joined the firm 2 years ago after being asked to leave his previous position under circumstances that were never fully explained. Sandra Whitmore, the chief marketing officer, who was married to a man who played golf with Richard's father-in-law, and Christopher Davenport, the head of business development, whose primary qualification seemed to be that he had been Richard's roommate at Princeton. When I walked in and saw them all seated around the table, I felt the first flicker of unease. But I pushed it down. I told myself that Richard probably wanted witnesses to what he expected to be a positive conversation. I told myself that this was an opportunity to make my case in front of the people who could actually influence decisions. Richard was seated at the head of the table. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my first car and a watch that cost more than my first year's salary combined. He smiled when I entered, but even then, I noticed something in that smile that I had never seen before. Or perhaps I had always seen it and simply refused to acknowledge what it meant. He gestured for me to sit down. Then he asked me what I wanted to discuss. I began my presentation. I spoke about my tenure with the company, about the relationships I had built, about the assets I had brought in. I showed slides with data, with testimonials from clients, with industry comparisons. I was professional. I was thorough. I realize now, completely naive about what was actually happening. Richard listened with what appeared to be interest. He nodded at appropriate moments. He asked a few questions that seemed engaged and thoughtful. And when I finished, when I finally stated my request for a 20% increase in base compensation, plus a revised bonus structure that more accurately reflected my contributions, he leaned back in his chair and smiled again. Then he laughed. Not a chuckle. Not a polite expression of surprise. A genuine laugh, the kind that escapes when someone finds something truly, unexpectedly amusing. Bradley Hamilton and Christopher Davenport joined in almost immediately, though Sandra Whitmore had the grace to look uncomfortable. Richard said, and I will remember these words until the day I die, that he found it charming that I thought those numbers were appropriate. He said that he appreciated my enthusiasm, but that I seemed to have an inflated sense of my own importance. He said that the clients I managed were assets of the firm, not personal property, and that anyone with adequate training could maintain those relationships. He said that compensation discussions were typically reserved for employees who brought unique, irreplaceable value, and that while I was certainly competent was not the same as exceptional. Then he looked around the table at his colleagues, still smiling, and said something that I have replayed in my mind thousands of times since. He said that low-level staff often struggled to understand their actual position in the hierarchy, and that it was important to have these conversations so that expectations could be appropriately managed. Low-level staff. I had been with the company for 8 years. I had personally brought in over $200 million in managed assets. I had sacrificed relationships, health, and countless opportunities because I believed in Richard Ashworth and the company he had built. And to him, I was low-level staff. The meeting ended with Richard suggesting that we could revisit the conversation in a year or two, once I had demonstrated additional value. Bradley Hamilton made a joke about managing expectations that I did not hear clearly because blood was pounding in my ears. I stood up, thanked them for their time in a voice that did not sound like my own, and walked out of that conference room. I went directly to the bathroom on the 14th floor, the one that was rarely used because it was at the end of a hallway that led nowhere. I locked myself in a stall and sat there for 17 minutes, staring at the gray tiles, feeling something shift inside me that would never shift back. When I emerged, I had made a decision, but it was not the decision that Richard Ashworth would have expected. I did not march into his office and quit in a blaze of righteous anger. I did not send a furious email or make a scene that would have given him a story to tell at cocktail parties. Instead, I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, and began to plan. The first phase took 3 months. I needed information. I needed to understand exactly how the firm operated, not just the parts I was involved with, but everything. The financial structures, the client agreements, the internal processes, the vulnerabilities. Elena was instrumental during this period, though I did not tell her what I was planning. Not yet. I simply asked questions that seemed professional, that could be attributed to a desire to better understand the business. She answered them without suspicion because she trusted me. I began documenting everything. Every client interaction, every piece of proprietary information I had access to, every relationship I had built. I was careful to focus only on information I had legitimately created or been given access to through my work. Nothing stolen. Nothing that could later be characterized as corporate espionage. Just a comprehensive understanding of what I had built and how it connected to the larger structure. I also began paying attention to things I had previously ignored. The way Richard treated other employees. The comments he made about people when he thought only his inner circle was listening. The decisions that seemed to benefit certain people regardless of their performance. The patterns that Elena had tried to show me years ago. David Chen worked in accounting. He had been with the firm almost as long as I had, and occupied the kind of position that made him essentially invisible to senior leadership. He processed expense reports, managed vendor payments, reconciled accounts. He knew everything about the financial reality of Ashworth Capital, and he had long ago stopped expecting anyone to notice or care. I started having lunch with David. At first, he was suspicious. People like me did not typically seek out people like him for social interaction. But I was patient. I asked about his family, his interests, his career. I listened when he talked about his daughter's college applications and his son's struggles with anxiety. I remembered details and followed up on them in subsequent conversations. Slowly, he began to trust me. What David told me over those lunches confirmed suspicions I had not even fully formed. The firm's financial position was not as strong as it appeared. Richard had been making increasingly risky investment decisions in pursuit of higher returns, decisions that the board of directors did not fully understand because the reports they received were carefully curated to obscure the true level of exposure. There were clients whose accounts were being managed in ways that technically complied with regulations but violated the spirit of the agreements they had signed. There were expenses being categorized in ways that would not survive serious scrutiny. I filed this information away. I did not act on it. Not yet. The second phase began 6 months after the conference room incident. I had identified the clients who were most loyal to me personally rather than to the firm. Margaret Hollister was at the top of that list. Over 8 years, I had become something like a surrogate son to her. She called me on holidays. She asked my advice about family matters that had nothing to do with finance. She trusted me in a way that had nothing to do with the Ashworth Capital brand. I began having conversations with Margaret that were slightly different from our usual discussions. I mentioned, casually, that I was considering my long-term career options. I expressed, carefully, some concerns about the direction of the firm. I did not ask her for anything specific. I simply planted seeds. Similar conversations happened with other clients. Thomas Blackwell had always valued my understanding of his ethical requirements and had expressed frustration in the past about dealing with other representatives from the firm who did not share that understanding. The Chen family had made it clear on multiple occasions that their relationship was with me, not with Ashworth Capital. These were not coincidences. These were relationships I had deliberately cultivated over years, long before I understood exactly how valuable they would become. 11 months after the conference room meeting, I submitted my resignation. I gave the standard 2 weeks' notice. I was professional, courteous, and completely unremarkable in my departure. Richard did not even bother to meet with me personally. He sent Bradley Hamilton to conduct the exit interview, which lasted approximately 12 minutes. Bradley asked the standard questions about my reasons for leaving, my future plans, and whether I had any concerns about the firm that I wanted to raise. I answered vaguely and pleasantly. I said I was exploring new opportunities. I said I wished the firm continued success. I said nothing that could later be used against me. My last day was a Friday in late September. Elena took me to lunch and asked me what was really happening. I told her that I could not explain yet, but that I would be in touch soon. She looked at me with an expression that suggested she understood more than I was saying, and she nodded. I walked out of the Ashworth Capital building at 5:37 in the evening, carrying a box of personal items that I had carefully sorted to ensure I was taking nothing that belonged to the company. The security guard wished me good luck. I thanked him and stepped out onto the street. The next phase had already begun. During my final months at Ashworth Capital, I had quietly been laying the groundwork for a new firm. I had consulted with attorneys about non-compete agreements and determined that the clause in my contract was narrowly written and would not prevent me from starting a competing business. I had secured a small office space in a building downtown. I had begun conversations with potential investors who were interested in backing a firm built on principles of transparency and genuine client service. The day after my departure from Ashworth Capital, I made phone calls. Margaret Hollister was my first call. I explained that I had left the firm and was starting my own investment advisory company. I told her that I would completely understand if she preferred to remain with Ashworth Capital, that I was not asking her for any immediate decision, and that I simply wanted to inform her personally rather than having her learn about my departure from someone else. She interrupted me before I could finish. She said she had been waiting for this call. She said she had been concerned about some of the communications she had received from the firm in recent months, communications that suggested her accounts might be managed differently going forward. She said that her trust had always been in me, not in Richard Ashworth or his company. She asked how quickly she could transfer her assets to my new firm. The Chen family said yes within 48 hours. Thomas Blackwell needed a week to review the structure I was proposing, but ultimately agreed to move his entire portfolio. Within a month of leaving Ashworth Capital, I had secured commitments representing over $170 million in assets under management. Within 3 months, that number had grown to $240 million. The firm I built was called Cornerstone Advisory. The name was deliberate. I wanted to signal stability, foundation, trustworthiness, everything that Ashworth Capital had pretended to be. Elena joined me 2 months after I left. She had seen what was happening and recognized an opportunity that aligned with her own ambitions and values. She became my chief operating officer, and she brought with her a detailed understanding of the operational inefficiencies at Ashworth Capital that we could exploit. I also made David Chen an offer. He was reluctant at first. He had spent his entire career avoiding risk, and joining a startup firm felt dangerously uncertain. But I explained to him what I was building and, more importantly, I explained to him what I knew about the financial vulnerabilities at his current employer. I told him that I believed difficult times were coming for Ashworth Capital and that I was offering him an opportunity to be part of something better before that happened. He thought about it for 2 weeks. Then he said yes. With David came information that I could not have obtained any other way. He had maintained meticulous personal records throughout his career, not because he planned to use them, but because that was simply the kind of person he was. Those records painted a picture of Ashworth Capital that the board of directors had never seen. A picture of increasing risk exposure, of questionable accounting practices, of investments that were performing far worse than the official reports suggested. I did not use this information directly. That would have been illegal, and I was building something that needed to be completely legitimate. But I did use it to make strategic decisions about timing, about which clients to approach, and about how to position Cornerstone Advisory in the market. The first year was hard. We operated on minimal resources, took below-market salaries, and worked hours that made my time at Ashworth Capital look like a vacation. But we were building something real, something based on genuine value rather than connections and inherited wealth. Our clients noticed the difference. They told their friends, their colleagues, their family members. Slowly, our reputation began to grow. Richard Ashworth did not notice us at first. We were too small to appear on his radar. He was busy with more pressing concerns. The market conditions that David had predicted were beginning to materialize. Several of the risky investments Richard had championed were underperforming dramatically. Key clients were asking uncomfortable questions about their portfolio returns. The departure of significant assets following my exit had created liquidity pressures that made it harder to navigate the challenging environment. I tracked all of this carefully. Not out of vindictiveness, though I will not pretend that was entirely absent. I tracked it because I was looking for opportunities. The first major opportunity came 18 months after I left. Ashworth Capital had been in discussions with a technology company called Meridian Systems about becoming their exclusive financial advisor. Meridian was preparing for an initial public offering that was expected to be one of the largest of the year, and the advisory fees associated with that process would be enormous. Richard had been personally courting the Meridian leadership for months. What Richard did not know was that Meridian's CEO, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, had a sister who was married to Thomas Blackwell's son. The connection was distant enough that it would not have appeared in any obvious research, but it was real enough that when Thomas mentioned to his daughter-in-law that he had moved his assets to a new firm run by someone exceptionally talented and trustworthy, the information eventually made its way to Patricia. I received a call from Patricia Okonkwo on a Tuesday afternoon. She said that she had heard interesting things about Cornerstone Advisory and wanted to learn more about our approach. We met for dinner the following week. Patricia was brilliant, demanding, and exactly the kind of client I had dreamed of working with. She asked difficult questions and expected intelligent answers. She challenged assumptions and tested reasoning. She was not interested in flattery or promises. She wanted to understand exactly how we would add value to her company's financial future. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, she had decided to terminate her discussions with Ashworth Capital and engage Cornerstone Advisory instead. The Meridian IPO would be handled by us. I learned later that Richard had been personally informed of this decision by Patricia herself. She had called him to explain that she had found an advisor whose approach better aligned with her company's values. Richard had apparently been confused, then angry, then desperate. He had offered to reduce fees, to provide additional services, to make whatever accommodations were necessary. Patricia had declined politely but firmly. She had made her decision. The Meridian IPO was successful. It generated significant fees for Cornerstone Advisory and, more importantly, established our reputation in a way that no amount of marketing could have achieved. Suddenly, we were not a small startup challenging the established order. We were a legitimate competitor. Over the following 2 years, our growth accelerated. We hired carefully, bringing in people who shared our values and our work ethic. We expanded our service offerings. We moved into larger offices. We began attracting clients who had never been associated with Ashworth Capital, people who were drawn to us based purely on our track record and reputation. Throughout this period, I watched Ashworth Capital decline. The departure of major clients had been just the beginning. The risky investments continued to underperform. Internal conflicts emerged as senior leaders began positioning themselves for survival rather than success. Good employees left for better opportunities. The ones who remained were increasingly demoralized. David Chen's former colleagues would occasionally reach out to him, sharing information about the deteriorating conditions. They described an atmosphere of paranoia, of blame, of desperate attempts to maintain appearances while the foundation crumbled. Richard Ashworth, once confident and commanding, had become volatile and unpredictable. He blamed everyone except himself for the firm's troubles. The next major opportunity came during the third year. Ashworth Capital had been attempting to raise additional capital to address their liquidity challenges. They had approached several investors, including some who had previously expressed interest in Cornerstone Advisory. Through these channels, I learned that the firm was willing to consider offers for partial or complete acquisition. I spent 6 months preparing. Working with Elena and our legal team, I developed a comprehensive understanding of Ashworth Capital's true financial position. We analyzed their client base, their operational costs, their outstanding obligations. We identified the specific assets that would be valuable and the liabilities that would need to be managed. We built a detailed model of what an acquisition would look like and what it would cost. Then I began assembling the capital necessary to make an offer. This was more complex than simply writing a check. It required convincing our existing investors to support an expansion that would more than double our size. It required securing additional financing from sources who believed in our strategy. It required demonstrating that we had the operational capacity to absorb and integrate a much larger organization. Elena was skeptical at first. She worried that we were growing too fast, that we were taking on unnecessary risk, that we were letting personal motivations influence business decisions. She was partially right about the last concern. I will not pretend that the prospect of acquiring Richard Ashworth's company was purely a business calculation. But I was able to show her that the numbers worked, that the opportunity was genuinely compelling regardless of my personal history, and that we were positioned to execute successfully. The offer was submitted on a Monday in early spring, almost exactly 4 years after I had walked out of that conference room. Richard Ashworth's initial reaction was predictable. He rejected the offer without serious consideration, dismissing Cornerstone Advisory as a minor competitor that could not possibly absorb a firm of Ashworth Capital's stature. He told his board of directors that the offer was insulting and that better options would emerge. But better options did not emerge. The market conditions continued to deteriorate. The client departures continued to accelerate. The internal problems continued to compound, and our offer remained on the table. 3 months later, Richard called me directly. I remember the sound of his voice. It was different from what I remembered. The confidence was still there, but it was forced now, a performance rather than a natural expression. He suggested that we meet to discuss the proposed acquisition in more detail. He said that there might be creative structures that could work for both parties. He said that he believed our firms shared fundamental values and that a combination could be powerful. I agreed to meet him. We scheduled a dinner at a restaurant that he selected, an expensive establishment where I had once accompanied him as a junior employee, sitting quietly while he entertained important clients. He arrived 15 minutes late, which I recognized as a deliberate tactic to establish dominance. He was wearing the same kind of suit he had always worn, though I noticed that it did not fit quite as well as it once had. He ordered wine without asking my preference, and launched into a monologue about the acquisition that was clearly rehearsed. He proposed that he remain as a senior advisor following the acquisition. He suggested that the combined firm should retain the Ashworth Capital name. He indicated that certain members of his leadership team should be guaranteed positions. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes without pausing for input. When he finally stopped, I took a moment before responding. I told him that I had listened carefully to his proposals. I told him that I appreciated his perspective. Then I told him that none of what he had suggested was acceptable. The firm would be renamed immediately following the acquisition. There would be no guaranteed positions for any existing Ashworth Capital employees. All personnel decisions would be made based on performance and cultural fit, and his role as senior advisor was not something I was prepared to discuss. His face changed. The manufactured confidence evaporated, and I saw something underneath that I had never seen before. Fear, desperation, a recognition that the power dynamic he had always assumed was no longer functioning. He began to argue, to negotiate, to make the case for his indispensability. He pointed out his relationships with certain clients. He emphasized his knowledge of the industry. He suggested that the acquisition would be more successful with his involvement. I listened patiently. Then I said something that I had been waiting 4 years to say. I reminded him of our meeting in the conference room. I quoted his exact words about low-level staff not understanding their position in the hierarchy. I described how that moment had felt, how it had changed everything I thought I understood about loyalty and respect. I explained that I had spent the years since then building something that would eventually bring me to this exact moment. Then I told him that his time for being worth my time had ended. The dinner concluded shortly afterward. Richard left without finishing his meal, mumbling something about needing to consult with his advisors. I remained at the table for another hour, ordering dessert and coffee, thinking about the journey that had brought me there. The acquisition was completed 2 months later. The final terms were substantially less favorable to Richard than my original offer had been. The deterioration of Ashworth Capital during the negotiation period had reduced its value significantly, and I was under no pressure to close quickly. Richard's board of directors ultimately forced him to accept terms he had initially rejected as insulting. On the day the paperwork was signed, I walked into the Ashworth Capital building for the first time in 4 years. The security guard who had wished me luck on my last day was still there. He recognized me immediately and smiled. I spent that day meeting with employees, explaining what the transition would look like, answering questions about the future. Most of them were nervous, uncertain about their prospects under new ownership. I tried to reassure them while being honest about the evaluation process that would follow. Richard was not present for any of these meetings. He had been required to vacate his office as part of the acquisition terms, and I learned later that he had done so at 6 in the morning before any other employees had arrived, taking only personal items and leaving no note or explanation. The integration process took nearly a year. It was difficult, complex work that tested our operational capacity in ways I had not fully anticipated. Some Ashworth Capital employees transitioned successfully and became valuable members of the Cornerstone team. Others did not fit the culture we had built and departed within the first few months. The client base was consolidated, redundancies were eliminated, and the combined firm emerged stronger than either predecessor. During this process, I received periodic updates about Richard Ashworth. He had attempted to start a new firm, but his reputation had been damaged by the failure of Ashworth Capital, and he struggled to attract investors or clients. He had explored positions at other established firms, but the industry was small enough that his story was well known, and opportunities did not materialize. His marriage, which had been troubled for years according to people who knew the family, ended in divorce. His lifestyle, which had been built on the assumption of continued success, became increasingly difficult to maintain. 18 months after the acquisition, I received an email from an address I did not immediately recognize. It was from Richard Ashworth, asking if I would be willing to meet. I agreed. He arrived at my office on a Thursday afternoon. The transformation was startling. He had aged visibly in the months since our last meeting. His suit was still expensive but no longer new, and he wore it with an uncertainty that I had never seen before. He sat in the chair across from my desk, the same desk that had once been his, and struggled to begin speaking. Eventually, He asked if there might be a position for him at the firm. He did not specify what kind of position. He did not make a case for his qualifications. He simply asked, with a humility that seemed genuine, if there was any way he could be useful. I considered this question for a long moment. Part of me wanted to reject him immediately, to give him the same dismissive treatment he had once given me. Part of me wanted to say something cutting, to remind him again of the words he had spoken in that conference room. But I realized that doing so would not give me what I was actually seeking. The revenge I had imagined, the satisfaction of humiliating him the way he had humiliated me, would not actually bring closure. It would simply extend a cycle that I was ready to end. Instead, I told him the truth. I told him that I had spent years building something specifically designed to prove that his judgment about my value had been wrong. I told him that the acquisition of his company had been, in part, a personal statement about what happens when loyalty is betrayed and worth is underestimated. I told him that I had thought often about this exact moment, about what I would say if he ever came to me asking for help. Then I told him that I would consider his request, not because I owed him anything, not because I had forgiven the way he had treated me, but because I had built a company based on evaluating people fairly, on giving opportunities to those who deserve them, on being better than the organization I had left behind. If I rejected him purely out of spite, I would be betraying those principles. I asked him to submit an application through our normal hiring process. I told him that he would be evaluated like any other candidate based on his skills, experience, and cultural fit. I told him that I could not promise any particular outcome, but that he would receive honest consideration. He thanked me, quietly, and left. The application process took several weeks. Richard was interviewed by multiple members of the team, including Elena and David. The evaluations were mixed. His industry knowledge was extensive, but his interpersonal style was problematic. His strategic thinking was strong, but his willingness to take direction was questionable. His reputation preceded him in ways that made some team members uncomfortable. In the end, we offered him a position. Not a senior role, not anything resembling the authority he had once held. A mid-level consulting position, working with clients on specific projects, reporting to people who had once reported to people who reported to him. He accepted. I will not pretend that the adjustment was smooth. Richard struggled with taking direction from people he clearly viewed as subordinates. He struggled with the cultural expectations of an organization that valued collaboration over hierarchy. He struggled with the reality that his past accomplishments did not automatically confer present authority. But he also, gradually, began to change. I observed this change over months, through reports from his supervisors and occasional direct interactions. The arrogance that had defined him began to soften. The dismissiveness toward others became less automatic. He began listening more than speaking, learning rather than lecturing. Whether this change was genuine or simply a survival adaptation, I could not say with certainty, but it was noticeable. 2 years after he joined the firm, Richard asked for a meeting with me. He wanted, he said, to apologize. We sat in my office, the same room where he had once laughed at my request for fair compensation, and he spoke for nearly an hour. He talked about his career, about the assumptions he had made, about the people he had dismissed without recognizing their value. He talked about losing his company, his marriage, his status, and how those losses had forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about success and worth. He talked specifically about me, about how wrong he had been to treat me the way he did, about how he understood now that the qualities he had dismissed were exactly the qualities that had built something he could never have built himself. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply offered the apology and said that he would understand if it changed nothing about how I viewed him. I thanked him for speaking honestly. I told him that the apology was meaningful, even if it could not undo the past. I told him that I had learned from our shared history, that his treatment of me had been part of what motivated me to build something better, and that I had come to see even the painful parts of that journey as necessary. Then I told him something I had not planned to say. I told him that I no longer thought about revenge, that the satisfaction I had expected from his downfall had been real but temporary, and that what had replaced it was something more valuable. The company I had built, the people I worked with, the clients who trusted me, the proof, every single day, that my worth was not determined by anyone else's opinion of it. Richard nodded. I saw something in his eyes that might have been understanding. He still works for the company. His performance reviews are adequate, neither exceptional nor problematic. He has found a role that suits his remaining capabilities and seems to have made peace with its limitations. We do not interact frequently, but when we do, there is a mutual respect that would have been impossible during the years when I worked for him. Sometimes, when I am alone in my office late at night, I think about the journey that brought me here. The conference room where I was humiliated, the months of careful planning, the years of building, the acquisition, the conversation where he asked for a job, all of it interconnected, each event leading inevitably to the next. I think about what I would tell my younger self, the person who sat in that bathroom stall staring at gray tiles, feeling something break inside. I would tell him that the breaking was necessary, that what felt like destruction was actually the beginning of construction, that the worst moment of his professional life would become the foundation of his greatest success. The betrayal I experienced was real, the humiliation was real, the years of work and sacrifice and doubt were real. But so is the company that bears my values, the team that shares my vision, and the life I have built from the ashes of what Richard Ashworth tried to take from me. This is not a story about forgetting. The memory of that conference room will never disappear. It lives in me, part of the fuel that still drives me forward. This is a story about transformation, about taking something painful and using it to build something meaningful, about proving worth not through argument but through result, about patience that extends for years and execution that does not waver. Richard Ashworth once laughed when I asked for a raise. He told me that low-level staff like me were not worth his time. He dismissed years of loyalty and contribution as if they meant nothing. Now I own the building where he humiliated me. I run the company that bears his family name no longer. I employ the people who once answered to him. And every morning, when I walk through those doors, I am reminded that the best revenge is not destruction. The best revenge is becoming the person that the betrayer could never imagine you becoming, and watching them slowly realize that their greatest mistake was underestimating what you were capable of building. The chairman said I was not worth his time. He was wrong.